I think that software companies are underestimating how hard it is to add in internationalization to a website. It's a very complex problem, especially if you're internationalizing for several countries or several languages. There's a lot of nuances and there's a lot of details that people miss or people don't expect because maybe they don't know a certain language or they don't know a certain culture. And it's not just translating, there's a million other things that people need to think about when they think about internationalization. And a lot of the times they think it's easy and maybe it's not. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. I think the unknowns is the sort of more significant part because people make assumptions. So they're like, well, I have to translate this, so I'm just going to make it into another language. But there's stuff around grammar and there's stuff around the length of words that people don't expect. So for example, if you have in maybe like a UI, you have a button. In German, words are really long and maybe you didn't leave room. And then when you try to translate it, it doesn't fit. So it's something that you have to think about early because otherwise your assumptions may be wrong and you might have to go back to the drawing board. The good thing about internationalization is that it's based on a lot of standards. So it's not necessarily specific to one programming language, but Unicode, for example, the Unicode Consortium has a lot of standards around how to deal with the thing, how to deal with the sort of like dates, the times. They have a database that they maintain with stuff like months, dates, years, that kind of thing. There's also specific standards for what a locale is, which is how you identify a specific language and region combination. So a lot of these are universal to programming languages. And then there's individual libraries and there's individual packages depending on what language you're using. But if you learn about the standards first, you'll have a good base to handle it in any type of software. I think companies or software developers should definitely think about it early. I don't think it necessarily has to be the very first thing, but it should be there right at the beginning, which a lot of the time gets ignored because of budget or time, but actually, especially even in a local market. So for example, I live in the UK, which is, everybody speaks English mostly, but there's actually 4 million people whose native language is not English. Even in England, they invented English, So even in a local market, I think people overlook it a lot. And it's important to think about it early, to understand who you're targeting. The internet in general has a habit of making everything in English, even though the world's internet users are not necessarily a majority of English speakers. So it's even an accessibility concern, I would say, to make pages or apps or software accessible to more people around the world. But when you go into a new market, you definitely should be thinking about internationalization so that your designs are fitting your UX. And also, it's a lot easier from a software perspective, to integrate internationalization into your app at the beginning rather than retrofit it afterwards. It's actually a lot more work. Oh, yes, definitely. There's a lot of gendered languages, like Spanish. Yeah. Even inanimate objects are gendered, right? In English, that's not the case. And especially now, we've gotten a lot more used to referring to people by a non-gendered pronoun, for example, in English, like they, which gets harder in Spanish. It gets harder in other languages that are more gendered as well, like French, I think, is very gendered. And also, from a software perspective, when you write copy, when you write sort of like the text that goes in your app, in your site, even in your documentation, you have to make it flexible as a whole, because some people will try to translate maybe just a word or just a phrase without thinking that it might need a different pronoun or it might need to be gendered as an inanimate object when you translate it. So some of the things that are gendered in Spanish might be gendered the opposite in French, that kind of thing.